President Alassane Ouattara is running for a third term. It comes after the death of Prime Minister Amadou Gon Coulibaly back in July. Sliding into a power struggle would be a major setback for the world's biggest cocoa producer, where years of political stability and international support have fueled an economic turnaround for the nation at large. Now, rooting out the possibility of postponing the presidential election scheduled for the end of October, we chat to author of Africa is Open for Business, Victor Kgomoeswana, about the implications of this decision ahead of the elections at the end of the month. Victor, good morning. Thank you very much for joining us here on Weekend Dawn. I mean, we've literally seen the stakes are high as elections are set to happen at the end of October. President Ouattara seeking a third-term bid. Many questioning this leadership vacuum that, of course, has happened and perhaps how it's threatening the stability of the world's biggest cocoa producer at this point. I mean, looking at what is currently transpiring ahead of the elections, what do you make of what's unfolding on that front as we speak?
Good morning, Liesl. It makes me nervous to no end because you mentioned it. This is the world's largest cocoa producer. Not only is it the world's largest cocoa producer, it's the next door neighbor of the second largest cocoa producer in Ghana, and Nigeria is not far off. It's part of a very important regional economic bloc, the economic community of West African states. Lastly, it is what you may consider the de facto headquarters of French-speaking Africa, and it is the gateway to West Africa, especially for French-speaking Africa. By the way, let's not forget that it's not long ago that the African Development Bank, the largest or one of the largest infrastructure development finance institutions, returned to Abidjan as the headquarters of this African Development Bank. And not far from there, next door, is the Secretariat of African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So it is in a very critical area. And under the leadership of President Alassane Ouattara, Ivory Coast or Côte d'Ivoire managed to recover and regain the international respect of investors almost back to the days of the founding father, Felix Houphouët-Boigny, who died in 1993, and as you remember, set this series of events that led to where we are today. But when you see a president, going for the third term against what the Constitution says, and when you see only 4 candidates out of 44 being approved because lots of them are disqualified by the Electoral Commission for all kinds of reasons, you know there is a problem. Because you already know that there's likely to be a boycott. There is a meeting, I think, today of opposition parties that are trying to get President Alassane Ouattara to concede to the demand that the elections either be postponed or be conducted in a different environment. So I'm very nervous.
Now, Victor, you've mentioned the candidates that obviously have been brought to the spotlight and the deep economic and social ills that have also come to the fore even prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. But I think before we delve into that, I just wanted to look at the positioning of the Ivory Coast within the African continent at large. As you mentioned, it's the world's biggest cocoa producer and also the leader on that front within the Francophone West African region. Looking at the turnaround strategy of President Ouattara, perhaps his commitment to economic growth, I think there was about an 8% economic expansion during his 10-year tenure since he came into power. Looking at some of the successes he achieved in infrastructure development, amongst others, how would you rate his process as a president to date?
Very highly. Those are the 2 words. I rank his performance. I mean, you need to get to a place like Abidjan just to appreciate the difference. By the way, Liesl, there are 2 things that I just want to mention. Not that they are all the things that matter in terms of economic development. There's a big bridge called the HBK bridge, HKB bridge, which is part of the infrastructure. It's the equivalent in South Africa of what we call the Gilulis flyover interchange. You know, just the development of this bridge in the capital, Abidjan, the economic capital, Abidjan, changed the entire configuration. And the reason I'm mentioning this bridge, as big a project, a multi-billion rand project as it is because it was invested in or it's led by a South African company in Harris Growth Partners. So it is one of those areas where South Africa has led in a big way by investing in infrastructure. Secondly, we call Ivory Coast or Cote d'Ivoire the largest producer of cocoa. But what we don't remember is in the tenure of President Alassane Ouattara, a French company called Semois, among others, were part of the international investors that came into Ivory Coast to do what we have been calling for, which is the beneficiation of agricultural commodities. So Ivory Coast is now a cocoa producer, but it's also found a way to beneficiate the cocoa and produce chocolate locally, which is what we are crying out for. And you might remember last year when President Ouattara was here in South Africa, we spoke of how they cut a deal with other cocoa producers to make sure that they can give their farmers a fair deal. That's a lot of success economically because it is asserting the position of African countries that have so far been known for producing commodities, be they mining or agricultural, and just sending them overseas. So I rate him very highly. The question is, does rating him highly excuse him now extending the term now that his successor or chosen successor or preferred successor died in July? So I am very nervous about it, but at the same time, I say let us not overlook to give him credit for the changes that he facilitated during his reign.
Now, Victor, you mentioned some of the candidates, in fact, 4 out of 44 that have been authorized to participate in these elections. And I'm just looking at also that failed coup attempt back in 2002, the violent protest that took place back in 2010 for about a year until 2011. Looking at the stability that the economy is currently experiencing at large, I mean, how is the opposition viewing the running rather of President Ouattara for the 3rd term? I mean, how does this ultimately impact the stability of the economy and also within that region at large going into the elections at the end of October?
Yeah, you mentioned a very key word, stability. You know, sometimes democracy takes a back seat if stability can be guaranteed. The problem is the opposition leaders are opposed to this, and they are saying he's using bullying tactics in a way because he's finding a way of using the state institutions to disallow the participation of other candidates who oppose him, which means he's paving the way for a clear-cut victory. But remember, France has also called for the postponement. Now, when France, as the former colonist, calls for the postponement of the election, they are reminding me of 2002 when they started throwing their weight behind people opposed to then President Laurent Gbagbo, who's also trying to run for this election but got disqualified by the IC, even though the African Court of Justice in Arusha, Tanzania has said they are qualified to run. So the stability versus democracy will always be that balancing act that Africans and developing countries in total will have to juggle with. Because sometimes, as you see in a country like Rwanda, there's a lot of stability, but there are many people who say, well, President Paul Kagame is not necessarily the most democratic president, but he has been in power effectively since 2000, and we know the story of the country. So do we want democracy at all costs? Or do we want democracy that translates into economic development? Or do we want economic development barring everything else that we consider important in the civilized world?
Well, Victor, I'm going to have to conclude this conversation, but we have spoken about some of the economic strides and also challenges that have taken place within the country, but we also mentioned the issue of stability versus democracy at large. Now, as elections loom come the end of October and protests are erupting, I mean, we've seen an increase in protests often touted as violent. What are your predictions for the upcoming elections? What are you actually seeing transpiring?
Man, there's something called incumbency. When somebody is in power, he has control over the state machinery. Remember, he's the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ivory Coast. Unless he suffers that kind of loss of support of the armed forces, I'm sure he's still the incumbent president, even with France calling for him to postpone the election. I predict that there will be some kind of compromise before the 31st. I don't see how elections are going to be postponed Because again, as I mentioned, I don't agree with President extending their terms beyond what they were supposed to have been running. I suspect that Alassane Ouattara might be the most desirable factor from a viewpoint of stability. And in Africa, I will prioritize stability if at least it is going to make sure that we can get somewhere in developing, especially the economic welfare and self-reliance of the African continent. I don't favor his politics, but I suspect he's going to be holding all the aces here with regard to even persuading countries like France to be able to see
Victor,
things
we're
this
going
way,
to have to leave that conversation there. All South Africa is open for business. Victor Kgomoeswana, of course, chatting to us about this month's elections, rather, taking place at the end of October within the Ivory Coast. Very good. Thank you very much.